growing up and being able to walk to school, walk to go meet up with friends or go ride bikes in the neighborhood, that in retrospect was kind of a radicalizing experience, because I realized later on that it's become increasingly rare.
That's the voice of Gregory Shill, a law professor at the University of Iowa and today's guest on Your Daily Detroit for Friday, August 23rd, 2019. I'm Sven Gustafson.
And I'm Jer Stays. Today's episode is all about cars, specifically about how the law has paved the way for their dominance in our everyday lives, shaping the way we live in fundamental ways. Professor Shill recently wrote a piece in The Atlantic headlined, "Americans Shouldn't Have to Drive, but the Law Insists on It," and we'll of course link to it in the show notes.
It's an especially germane topic here in Detroit, where there's been so much controversy over adding protected bike lanes on busy roads, and the recent decision to permanently close the Spirit of Detroit Plaza to vehicle traffic. My conversation with Professor Shill is coming up right after this.
Daily Detroit is brought to you in part by Lawrence Tech. Traditional four-year students love Lawrence Technological University's thriving campus life, but LTU has always met non-traditional students' needs too. Lawrence Tech offers over 100 degree and certificate programs that can get adult students started or back on track, and most classes are conveniently offered evenings at LTU's beautiful Southfield campus or online, so you can balance your social, family, and work life even while you power up your career. Find out more at ltu.edu, and we'll have a link in the show notes.
Our guest today recently wrote in The Atlantic, it reads in part, quote, "In a sense, America is car dependent by choice, but it is also car dependent by law." Professor Gregory Shill grew up in Ann Arbor and says he grew up going to the Detroit Auto Show. He joins us from Chicago via Skype. Kind of just to set the table, what got you interested in this topic of sort of how the American legal system reinforces our car dependency?
Well, I think in retrospect, growing up and being able to walk to school, walk to go meet up with friends or go ride bikes in the neighborhood, that in retrospect was kind of a radicalizing experience, because I realized later on that it's become increasingly rare thanks to how we design our communities and our transportation systems. When I went to law school and then later entered academia, I started thinking a little bit more systematically about this. I think there is a general awareness of how public policy tilts towards the car. The fact that, for example, you can drive across the country on government-financed freeways without paying any charges other than the gas and so forth for your car. But if you want to take a bus down the block, you have to pay. That's just one of probably hundreds of examples. What I was interested in with this project is the role that law plays in this, because we've had this discussion for about a century, actually, for longer than really any of us have been alive. I went back and looked, and the role of law is pretty consistently neglected.
Yeah, and you write that this kind of reinforcement of car dependency is firmly rooted in the federal, state, and even local levels. I wonder if you could kind of talk through those and give us sort of an example of each.
Let's start with vehicle design law. So this is how your car, what safety features it has.
Okay, this would be federal law.
This would be federal law set by NHTSA, which is the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. It's a DOT agency, and they say things like you have to have seatbelts, and they have to look like this, and you have to have airbags, and so forth. First of all, that's great. Nobody's saying that they shouldn't be doing that. In other words, they shouldn't be worrying about the occupants of the vehicles. Of course they should be. That's most of us, much of the time. But for a regulator that has a public interest in mind, they should also be thinking about the impacts of the vehicle on other people outside the vehicle. So that's people walking, using wheelchairs, bicycling, waiting for the bus. It's also people in other cars. There are no regulations that speak to that. So they're all designed to ensure crashworthiness of the vehicle itself. But there is a regulation called GTR 9 that at last count 44 of our peer countries have signed on to, that requires cars to be designed in a way to minimize impacts on people outside the vehicle. Like one quick example, there's a minimum amount of space required between the engine and the hood of the car, so that if you hit somebody and they fall on it, the hood will crumple without hitting the engine block. There are a lot of other examples like this. This seems to me like common sense, and we don't do it because we have a system built around cars.
How about at the state and local levels?
Let's start at the state level. So the setting and adjustment of speed limits. Speed limits are set in the first instance by statute, but then they're adjusted. And a lot of us aren't aware of how that happens. In most cases, it's done according to something called the 85th percentile method. And this is a method that's designed to ratchet speed limits up so that no more than 15% of people are violating them. So to give an example, let's say the legislature says the speed limit on a residential street by default will be 30 miles an hour. But your residential street is on the way to the freeway, and people tend to go, let's say 85% of them go 37 miles an hour or faster. Well, the local Department of Transportation can now, in some states, is obligated to raise the speed limit to either 35 or 40 miles an hour so that 85% of the motorists will be in compliance with the new speed limit. Of course, that's probably going to precipitate an increase in, another increase in how fast people drive, because people see the limit's 40. They know that law enforcement will give them, a window of forgiveness, so they may go 45 or 49. So this is a process that is tilted heavily, not just towards driving or cars, but to reckless, speedy driving. Speeding is responsible for over 10,000 deaths a year. Mm-hmm. This is not a harmless thing. And it also doesn't take any cognizance at all of what it's like to live in your neighborhood when your street becomes a freeway. So it doesn't take neighborhood impacts into account. It doesn't take pedestrian or bicyclist impacts. This is a federal manual that states have implemented and that localities often administer. At the local level, the predominant problem is zoning. None of us want to live next to a factory, okay?
Right.
But I think that's what we have in our mind when we think about how does zoning work. The history of zoning is interesting and has more complexity than we probably have time to get into today, but it is deeply entwined with white supremacy. It initially, advocates of zoning encoded explicitly racist language into zoning codes saying that African Americans couldn't live in this part of town, that kind of thing.
Right. Housing covenants, as they're often referred to here in Detroit. That's been a big issue in the history of Detroit.
Absolutely. There's a whole history of housing policy, a lot of which is racist, and zoning is a part of that. Now, I don't want to say zoning is intrinsically racist, but it has racist origins, and it has racially discriminatory effects today. Mm-hmm. It also just makes our lives a lot more complicated. You can't walk to the corner store because it's illegal to build a corner store in most neighborhoods in America. Really? If your kids are grown and you want to downsize to a condo, that literally may not be allowed in the town that you're in. You may have to move 20 minutes away, mm-hmm. and you may or may not like that place as much. And if you've lived in your town for 50 years, maybe you just as soon stay, but it's literally illegal. So it's not a matter of demand of market, or consumer preference. Mm-hmm. I and many of your listeners probably grew up in a single family home and maybe enjoyed that, but nobody's calling for abolishing that. What's curious is that our zoning codes from coast to coast, including in big cities, including in New York and San Francisco, and most of those cities, it is unlawful to build apartments.
And this is a big issue. As a matter of fact, on my way into the studio this morning, I was listening to NPR, and they were discussing affordable housing and the issue of single-family zoning in cities. And right now, I think Minneapolis they're either talking about it or they're actually getting rid of single-family zoning as a way to encourage more affordable housing. These issues seem kind of interlinked.
They do. They're very interlinked. The link is as follows. Many cities and suburbs will require that houses be on really big yards. Multiply it out across the city. Number one, it's impossible to walk anywhere. And if you spent time in suburban Detroit, you know that that's true in a lot of places.
Sure.
If you're lucky, you can walk to a gas station to get a jug of milk in a pinch. But
a lot of those neighborhoods don't even have sidewalks.
So it kills walkability. It's not very dense. So it's not impossible, but it's much more difficult to add sufficiently frequent transit that people will actually take it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's easy to add a bus. But the problem is if not very many people can walk to that bus stop, then it's not as useful. Through this land use mandate, we've locked our region into generations of car dependency. And then at the affordability level, it's expensive to maintain a single family home.
Yes.
They're big, they take a lot of energy, you have to replace the roof every so often, you got to take care of the yard. It doesn't have to be that way. And again, there are really nice parts about it, but it would be nice if our laws didn't require only that kind of use. There are very few places where it's lawful to build an apartment building. And often, even when it is lawful, the developer has to build housing for cars as well, which is a whole other layer of car dependency, but also expense. Underground parking spaces or garage parking can cost $50,000 a space. If your apartment is only $200,000, then that's, 25% of the cost.
Right. I mean, we see that here in Detroit. I live in Ferndale. I don't know if you're familiar with Ferndale, but it's a pretty progressive suburb, very pedestrian and bicycle friendly place. They're very pro-transit, the local government, but they still have parking requirements that they tack on to every development project that comes in the door in the city. Like, how did we get here? Like, how did the legal system become such a reinforcement tool of our car culture here in the United States?
It's a great question. There's no one, there's no one story that could be told about that. The first thing I want to say about that is that this is a system. It's not an ideology. Mm-hmm. So it's written into law. I call this automobile supremacy because it's not just that we're dependent on cars, but owning a car is a condition of full first-class citizenship in almost every place in America. A set of incentives that doesn't really care what your philosophy is. And so how does that come about? Well, in some cases, there's a story of lobbying and industry influence. And here I'm not just talking about the beloved big three, but also the oil industry, tire manufacturers, highway builders, so forth. They got together in the 1920s. There was a popular backlash against the car about a century ago because it was killing large numbers of people, principally children and people who lived in cities. The basic dynamic was that rich joyriders were driving around at reckless speeds, unregulated by the police, and striking and killing children in the street. And so there's this national backlash. There's a federal conference convened by the White House in 1924. There are front page editorials in all of the newspapers. There's a particularly colorful one in the New York Times that has a cartoon of the angel of death in a car running roughshod in his car over children's bodies. This is a major problem. It was called motor killings at the time. Now we don't even have a word for getting hit and killed by a car. It's a thing that happens.
Yeah, the pendulum has swung. Like, it's now just sort of an accepted part of automobile ownership.
It really is. Something I wrote about in the Atlantic article is the first person I remember knowing who was killed in a car crash on I-94 in 1995. 1 million Americans have been killed in car crashes since then.
So I wonder, are there any sort of significant movements afoot to kind of reform the legal system and, chip away at the primacy of the primacy of the car at all? And what kinds of things are they calling for, if so?
Yeah, there is a budding movement. There are basically, I think, two broad approaches that we're seeing, and they're interlinked. Mm-hmm. The first is a policy of promoting what are called complete streets. And this is the idea of a street like what you were describing in Ferndale, where folks can walk, bike, take the bus, or drive. And it's actually pleasant to walk around and pleasant to go from business to business on foot. You don't have to, if there's a long wait at a restaurant, you don't have to jump in the car, go to another one. You can just go around the corner. The problem is that's not possible if the speed limit on that street is, 45 miles an hour and people are going 55 and the police don't enforce that. So that's the name of the movement. It's closely related to something called Vision Zero, which is a vision of eliminating traffic deaths. The U.S. Department of Transportation and dozens of states and cities have committed to that goal. They've put less muscle behind it than they have the pledge itself. But these are efforts to change the design of the street so that it doesn't feel safe to go 55 miles an hour. Very few people would go 55 miles per hour on a residential street where there are cars parked, where there might be children playing even on the sidewalk.
Right.
We instinctively slow down, right? So there are a lot of changes that can be done at the street design level. And some of those are implemented by law. So some cities have adopted Vision Zero design standards. At the federal level, there is a new bill called the National Complete Streets Act that was introduced last week that would tie federal highway money to safer street designs. And then there's another federal bill called the Green Streets Act that would prod states to reduce driving and reduce greenhouse gases. So it's not just enough to declare a climate emergency, for example, as my city of Iowa City is currently debating. You have to actually put muscle behind that, and changing the way streets work is a good path. You mentioned the Minneapolis reform. Oregon just abolished single-family only zoning statewide. That doesn't mean somebody can put up a 50-story building next to you. I believe what it does is legalize fourplexes. So like basically a set of 4 townhouses that are attached. Basically all of the areas of law that I identify, they can be reversed. So the design standards, for example, those can be updated to include GTR 9. We can change our tort law so that people are incentivized to take more care when they're driving than they are currently. We can change our insurance law, which that's not even really working for people who rely on their cars, right? I believe Michigan has the highest insurance rates in the country.
Yep.
A lot of that is because the insurance laws is not that they promote the interests of drivers. It's somewhat the opposite. They promote driving.
Yeah.
They make it cheap to get into a crash in the sense that, you don't pay all that much. They don't reward people for safer driving. They don't require municipalities to implement proven methods to enhance safety and that sort of thing.
Right. His article in The Atlantic is headlined, "Americans Shouldn't Have to Drive, but the Law Insists on It." We'll link to it in the show notes. Gregory Shill is an associate law professor at the University of Iowa College of Law. Professor, thanks so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that's going to do it for today's show, friends. We'll have a link to Professor Shill's article in The Atlantic up on dailydetroit.com.
If you like what you're hearing on the show, consider supporting us by becoming a Patreon member. Help us push Detroit's conversation forward by visiting patreon.com/dailydetroit. And don't forget to tell your friends about the podcast.
And it's the weekend, so our thanks are to Cheyenne Nocerini for all her hard work behind the scenes. Thanks also to Randy Walker and Fletcher Sharp for their contributions. And of course, thank you for listening.
And thanks to the Narrowway Cafe for having us this week.
Absolutely. Clap, clap, clap.
I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.